Hey everybody, I wanted to make a quick response to an interesting foreign affairs video that went up, I believe, day before yesterday, maybe it was early yesterday. The video in question has a title. It's something like, "How does China want the war in Ukraine to end?" And it features two people I have a lot of respect for, Bonnie Lin from CSIS and the China Power podcast, and Alexander Gabuev, who's more of a he is a Russian and Central Asian, Eurasia subject matter expert. I believe he's at the Carnegie Center for International Peace and runs their Russia Eurasia Center. Um, and I thought it was a really interesting talk. I mean, on the one hand, it provided a lot of the kind of deep context for some of the geostrategic and diplomatic complexities that we're seeing play out between the People's Republic of China, Russia, and Ukraine, and the Western Alliance in the current conflict. Um, and for that reason, I would recommend everybody go watch it if you've got 40 minutes or so. At the same time, I think it provided an excellent kind of example of how discussion in geopolitics, in international affairs, in foreign policy realms, even in international studies realms, can kind of take on this nebulous characteristic. And it ties into a lot of thoughts I've been having lately about how we communicate around these issues, these complex issues, and how we do so on a medium like YouTube. And I'll circle back and talk about that at the end a little bit here. Um, but I wanted to kind of provide, since the video itself didn't, at least in my reading of it or watching of it, the content of the video never really got to the point, right? About what, if you went to that video wondering how does the Xi Jinping regime, how does the People's Republic of China want the war in Ukraine to end, I don't think that you would actually leave that video, having watched it, with a better idea of what the answer to that question would be. So, in other words, I don't think they ever really say what their opinions are on what that would be, what China's policy preferences, outcome preferences would be. So I thought I'd first talk a bit about sort of the three planks that I see there about what China's policy preferences are, outcome preferences are with the conflict in Ukraine, and then talk a bit about communication in geopolitics, international studies, foreign affairs in general, and how we might work to do a better job of that on a medium like YouTube. But to cut to the chase, I think the first policy preference, and these are all sort of couched in the understanding that we have entered a state of affairs here in Ukraine where China's first outcome preference, which would have been a quick Russian victory and a collapse of the Ukrainian state and an overthrowing of that state, obviously that outcome is not going to happen, right? And China, broadly speaking, would prefer that to be the outcome, both because they have a limitless friendship, so we're told, with Russia. But it's certainly at least a partnership with Russia that is complex but quite deep. And for that reason, they would want their friend in the international system to succeed in its goals within reason, right? So that's part of it. But there's the other side of the coin here is obviously China as a state has some similar concerns to Russia, or concerns it may see as similar in obviously in the actor of Taiwan, and wanting to in its mind reunify with Taiwan. A quick Russian victory and a collapse of the Ukrainian state, when faced with the overwhelming force of the Russian military, would have been China's obvious preference as a metaphorical lesson for the Taiwanese people and the Taiwanese leadership that resistance is futile, and that the same outcome would apply to them if and when the People's Republic of China wishes to invade Taiwan, or even intimate that it would invade Taiwan. So once that outcome of a quick victory for Russia, was sort of evaporated, I think that preference needs to kind of be shifted somewhat towards the first and most important plank of what China wants to see come out of this conflict is an outcome that does not involve regime change within the Russian Federation. That would be, basically on a continuum of complete failure and regime change on the one side, and on the Russian side, and then on the other side of that spectrum would be a complete success, and Russian regime change on the other. That's sort of the continuum as I see it for China, right? They would obviously prefer an outcome here. If a total Russian victory is no longer possible, they at least would prefer to avoid a complete Russian collapse. Secondarily, and I think maybe just as importantly, there is another sort of element here, I think, in the Chinese outcome preference matrix that we could think about as being something akin to they wish to see an outcome where there's a crack in the Western alliance. This is also obviously deeply related to the Taiwan issue, and I think one of the biggest surprises from the Ukraine conflict has been the almost unilateral consolidation of the Western alliance in the face of Russian aggression. I mean, you really have to, you do have to go back almost to the Napoleonic era or something like that to see a Europe so unified against one state in the system, right? I think there's huge lessons to take away from this period of history for multilateralism, for defensive alliances in general. There's a lot of videos and papers coming out now about how how the increased relevance of NATO interplays and impacts states that up until now have preferred to stay neutral and stay out of these kinds of alliances, right? There's a ton of, I think, historical takeaways that we haven't really even been able to scratch the surface of yet, but certainly vis-a-vis China, they're looking at an encirclement of a set of quite powerful allies in the Pacific region, and anything that would presage or indicate a cracking of that alliance system that really is centered around the hub of the wheel being the United States would be their preference for quite obvious reasons, because at the moment they're looking at kind of a dual lesson, right? They're looking at an admonishment of their designs for Taiwan and saying, well, if we make a move here, we can't discount a reality of a very robust and unified and organized counter movement from the Western Alliance, such as it is, or in this case, the U.S.-led alliance in the Indo-Pacific. But at the same time, you're also looking at lessons domestically for the Taiwanese people and the Taiwanese leadership that maybe they're not going to have to fight this war if it does occur completely alone, right? So I think as this progresses and as electoral politics progress in the NATO states and as this war drags on, I predict you will see further efforts by the Chinese and perhaps even the Russians in some way to continue to drive that wedge however they might be able to, whether that's in Slovakia, whether that's in Hungary, whether that's in Turkey. It remains to be seen, but certainly something to watch out for. And finally, I think there is an element here that's a bit more nebulous, but as a preference, I think the Chinese obviously would prioritize a resolution to this conflict that cannot be spun as a complete Ukrainian victory. And the reason that they don't want, and this is, I think, part of why you're seeing them sort of inject themselves into these discussion processes and pushing for an armistice or a resolution of the conflict without or perhaps happening before a Ukrainian counterattack. There's obviously a preference on the Chinese front that really they don't want an outcome that could be spun as a complete Ukrainian victory, right? And this again ties back into the Taiwan consideration. Even sort of a contested truce or a freezing of armed conflict, a freezing of the hot war into whatever position, as long as that in state it doesn't align perfectly with the 2014 boundaries or even obviously the boundaries before that, I think that would be China's preference. They would like to end this or freeze this conflict before that kind of an outcome. Again, for very similar reasons, right? They don't want this to be spun as some kind of rebel alliance victory where the Taiwanese people, the Taiwanese regime and the supporters of that regime and those people and that polity, that sort of state or aggregation of people could be seen as having a real chance at contesting and resisting an invasion by the People's Republic of China. That would be again disastrous for their designs in the region. So those are sort of my ideas around, maybe the three planks of what China's policy preferences, outcome preferences for the war are. Again, they are, really no Russian regime change. Cracks in the Western alliance would be excellent for them, would be a preference for them, and then finally, some kind of end state here that isn't a complete victory for the Ukrainian side. So that kind of is a segue, I think, a little bit into why I think the discussion that was had, it's really interesting. There's this paradigm that we have in international studies where I think the communication style is incredibly rhetorically complex, just like in any specialization in any academic discipline, or economics is this way, finance is this way. There's sort of a gatekeeping of rhetoric and rhetorical technique to set up these boundaries, and I think essentially defend the ways of knowing of a particular community, right? And I think that is part and parcel of all kind of academic disciplines. What worries me sometimes about international studies, international affairs, geopolitics, international relations, all these different disciplines, is you can get so lost in the sauce there, right? You can get so lost in the rhetorical tricks and turns of phrase and terms of art that at some point you can lose sight of the fact that you haven't actually provided the answer to the thing that you said you were going to do. And I think for as much heat as someone like Peter Zeihan gets for sort of glossing things over and speaking very definitively and sort of deterministically, right? He's not a very probabilistic communicator. He tends to kind of overassess his own confidence at times. What I will say, he has, really laid out a roadmap for public intellectuals and thinkers in political science, international studies, these different social science disciplines. What he does really well, right, and that's not to say he's not a serious thinker in some ways. I think he is in some ways, but what he does really well, and I think better than oftentimes what you'll see in these really heady foreign affairs type pieces, is he has a 4-minute script and he has a point to make, right? And he makes that point. You never leave his video. You may leave disagreeing, but you're not going to leave confused about what he was arguing. So I think there's always this contestation and this balance for people who want to do work in this realm, in this domain, to think about how do you balance appearing to be a serious person, appearing to analyze things probabilistically and deterministically, and sort of looking at the contingencies involved in the complex international relationships that kind of make these things happen or not happen, the ways in which evidence works or doesn't work, and the ways in which evidence intersects with policy and all these kinds of questions I think are really complicated. But it's always about finding that balance, and I think sometimes we could do a better job of leaning a little bit more towards the Zeihan side of things, because that's how you actually get people interested in the topic, and that's how you actually bring more people into thinking about these issues and getting educated about them. And that's really what we want ultimately in an open and pluralistic and democratic society, is for people to contest and think about and discuss these kinds of complex international topics. We don't want to build up moats in the way that we might have in the past. So anyway, a couple different topics there. I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts about that. First and foremost, maybe about how we can better communicate these things, maybe thoughts about how I communicate them and what I can improve at. I'm always open to hearing, but also obviously in this topic of the outcomes for the conflict, I'd be really interested to hear your feedback. Thanks again.